G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and today I'm going to do a video tutorial on drawing different body types. So as you can see here, I have a male and female, fairly generic, healthy, athletic figures. And in today's video, we're going to produce some more extreme representations of what these male and female bodies can look like, from the ultra thin to the overweight to the extremely muscular. And I'm going to talk about how to approach that from a foundation up approach. And when I say a foundation up, what I mean is what you're looking at here in this line work is the result. It's the finished bit people see. But underneath this skin are muscles. And muscles will affect how the skin sits and holds itself. And between the muscles and the skin, there is a layer of fat. So depending on how much fat there is, also depends on how much muscles are visible. And then underneath the muscles, of course, we have bones, or the skeleton, and this is what I call a construction skeleton. It's a really ultra simplified human skeleton that you can use as a foundation on which you add muscles and skin. And that's basically what I mean when I refer to a foundation up approach. Before we jump into the meat and bones of this tutorial, so to speak, you can get the reference file, this Photoshop file, and a PDF containing the finished illustrations that we produced through the tutorial for free from the link in the description as a reference files for download. And also, if you're interested in learning to draw the human body more than I can demonstrate in a single video or my other videos, there is an ebook I've made called Draw with Jazza Easy Anatomy, which you can check out with a link on the screen and in the description. So let's jump into it. Okay, so what I have here is a whole bunch of different body types ready to be made. So I have my generic reference on the left, and then we're going to go through creating thin body types, curvy body types, heavy, which you could either call overweight or obese, or, you know, much more in terms of the body mass of the fat, and then muscly and broad. So more the bodybuilder, comic book, hero type build. And we're going to go through these for the male and female, and as you can see, I've got the skeleton and a very faint outline of the skin for each of these body types. The reason I have this is because the reality is, whatever the body type, whether it be thin or ultra heavy or muscly, your skeleton does not drastically change if you gain or lose a huge amount of weight in either fat or muscle. What does change is how the skin around the muscle and around the fat reacts to what is on the body type. So we're going to go through working from the foundation of these skeletons and adding some muscle, adding some fat, and then putting the skin on top. So to begin with, we have the generic and the thin, and you can see them next to each other here with the same skeleton, and there's a rough skin outline that I can use to show you the difference between what is in the generic skin and what will end up being shown. And the first thing I want to cover is the muscles. So I'm going to hide my generic skin just to more clearly show the muscles underneath. In fact, I can actually bring the opacity of my skeleton on the left down just to show it more clearly. And using this as a reference, I can start to really rough in where the muscles will go on my skinny character. But the thing you need to keep in mind when drawing really skinny people is that being skinny isn't just a lack of fat, it's also a lower muscle mass, because when the body is starving or kind of burning energy to stay alive and there's not enough food going into the body, it burns first fat stores and then also muscle stores. So in going through the body, I'm just really roughly outlining the muscle positions, but I'm also bringing in the shape of the body. The bones will always stay in place. As you can see, the ribs and the hips are the shape and size that they are, but I'm really starting to edge in the muscles around the body for where the skin will go on top. And that is a pretty simple demonstration as to how you can go about that with some construction lines. Now, you can see if I hide my skin reference on the right that it does look quite a bit thinner than the character on the left, but it's going to be more pronounced when we get to the line work. But first, I want to come down here and do the same for the male, going through the construction and just bringing everything in just a little bit, keeping the bones in the same positions because, like I said, the skeleton doesn't really change, but let's say here with the shoulders, the muscle is going to be smaller. So I'm just going to edge that in, and all of the muscles around this character's body are going to be thinner. Same here with the area between the ribs and the pelvis. We have an area that's mostly muscle and body fat with the body organs inside. So the muscle and body fat being on the more surface part of the layer are going to be closer in because there's less mass there. Doing the same as we did with the female throughout the legs and just bringing everything in a bit. So we've got a very rough alteration to our skeleton and muscle structure here, and now I'm going to play with the line work. So I'm going to bring down the opacity of my construction just so it's easier to draw on. So the head is mostly going to be the same, just drawing a thin sort of head, but in terms of weight, there's not going to be much of a difference. But one thing that I will say is that while the muscles are smaller on a thin person, they are also more visible than on most people. The reason is that the layer of fat between their skin and their muscles is actually negligible. So we can see the lines dividing muscles. We can see the muscles working under the skin a lot more than we can on most generic physiques. So when you're drawing skinny people, though you draw them with lower body masses, it's also good to remember to outline where the muscles are, even though they're smaller. The other thing to keep in mind when drawing really skinny women is that the breasts are made up of fatty tissue, among other things, and they're smaller when they have low body fat. So the breasts on skinny women should never really be large when you draw them, unless of course they have had some, let's say, cosmetic assistance. Another thing to remember when drawing very thin people is that the muscle shows under the skin quite a lot, as I mentioned, but so does the bone. So wherever there is bone that would meet the surface, we make sure to indicate that as well. So for example, up here in the rib cage, at the top between the chest muscles and the breasts, we would actually indicate the ribs showing through, pressing against the skin. Following a similar process with the male, after we outline the head, we draw the skin around the body and make sure to outline where the muscles are in a fairly prominent way so that we can see that there's very little to no body fat on this character's body. Another thing to keep in mind is that while we associate having abs or six-pack abs with very muscular people, like I was sort of saying before, if they're thin and have very little to no body fat, these abdominal muscles are going to show through. So drawing really skinny people, I always show the abdominal muscles and always show the sinew joining different areas, as well as especially the ribs showing through in the middle of the chest. That's a really good way to indicate that someone has very little to no body fat and very thin and minimal muscle mass. So I've finished my skinny body type, and if I hide the muscles and skeletons that I've been working off of, you can see the difference between the generic and skinny body types. And you can see quite clearly that the skinny, really emaciated bodies still show quite a lot of muscle and sinew, but also the bone underneath. The muscle mass is smaller. There is very little to no fat under the skin layer, so we see a lot of that. But you can see, comparing them one next to the other, one is normal and sort of fairly healthy, has a bit of body fat, has extra muscle, and the other is very thin and emaciated. Moving on, our next body type is curvy. And as I mentioned previously, we're using the same skeleton. So even when someone has some extra curves going on, we're more working with the fat and the muscles and then working the skin around that and putting it on top. Now, when we're working with a curvy body type, we're working with more of the fat than the muscle. Previously, with a thin body type, we worked a lot with muscle because really that's all there was. There wasn't much body fat and we have very thin, small muscle mass to work with. Whereas with curvy people, while we still need to keep the muscle anatomy and structures in mind, we're more adding fat mass on top of that, but in a way that still keeps a fairly generic body type. So, for example, here in the torso, we're still bringing it into use something of an hourglass shape, so they're not going to be really round people with too much body fat, but we are going to add mass out to the sides, so out to the hips and the butt, and then the boobs are going to be bigger because we have more body fat here as well. So enlarging these. The arms are going to be a bit broader. Usually I like to bring out the shoulders a bit, bring up the upper arms a little bit too in a fairly soft way, and then plump out the forearms, but still keep the joints and the areas that sort of tuck in a bit more, like the waist and the elbows and things like that, still have those shapes moving in so that we have curves going out. And in the end, we're going to get a shape that has those feminine curves on this character that essentially identify the character as being curvy. Now with the legs, we're seeing less of the muscle. Originally, we would follow the muscle structures of the leg, which goes something like that. But when we're drawing curvy people, we're going to just sort of follow an organic, fairly rounded shape. Same with the legs. So we're not worrying about the muscles too much. We're sort of alluding to them slightly, but more worrying about how the fat is going to sit on the body and keeping an elegant shape at the same time as accentuating where the areas of fat under the skin are stored. So you can see when I bring up and hide my construction of a curvy person on top of my original lines, you can see essentially we're bringing everything out slightly, but still tapering in areas that keep that elegant look. But that is essentially how we create someone who's got a little bit of extra body and build to them without making them look too overweight. I'm going to do the same thing here with the male, and you may be thinking to yourself, how do you draw a curvy male? I suppose curvy is an adjective often used to describe the lusciously rounded ladies, but if I was to draw a male equivalent of someone curvy, we essentially want to make them look like they have more fat in their body, but not in a way that looks unhealthy, I suppose you could say. So something a bit more stocky and plump. Now in doing so, the female shape for a healthy body is usually something of an hourglass figure, like so. For a male body, an athletic or healthy body has something of a broad taper, a V taper that comes down in the middle and up and out around the shoulders. So if we bring the shoulders out a bit and we still keep the arms nice and large, but more soft than muscular, and bring out the chest so it's still a fairly broad character, and we just bring everything out just a little bit so that we have an extra layer of fat on top of these muscles, so we won't have too much muscle. We bring out the chest quite a lot because the chest being brought out makes them look nice and rounded and stocky without being too overweight looking. And we're just generally thickening things up, but in a way that's fairly soft. We're not trying to be too muscular. I'm going to bring out the stomach slightly just to accentuate the fact that he's got some curves. So we'll have a little bit of a pot belly, but nothing too obnoxious. So now we're ready to draw the line work on top of our construction lines. Our heads for most of these characters are going to be about the same sort of shape and size. And now with our curvy characters, we're just sort of adding some nice rounded lines on the outside. Now I do mean rounded. So for example, with our sinewy, skinny character, the lines are much more sharp and jagged. We're getting much more of an aggressive look in the lines. Whereas with these curvy characters, we're going for really soft and rounded, really bubbly and marshmallowy sort of feel. So we're making sure that the lines connect, that they have a nice curve to them to help accentuate that soft look in general. You will also notice that I'm really rarely, if at all, alluding to any muscle shapes or structures. I'm more drawing lines that reference how the skin is sitting on the layers of body fat. Same lessons apply to the male. Normally when I draw male figures to create a more masculine look, I use more solid and sharp lines. But when using this curvy aspect, we want to make them look a bit like a softer sort of character. So while accentuating features of masculinity more than I would so on the female character that I've drawn, I still want to make the character look rounded, plump and soft. So I'm making sure to keep my lines nice and gentle and curve them and connect them and make them look much more gentle in general. Okay, so I've finished drawing my curvy male and female, and if I hide my construction lines and skin reference, you can see, comparing the curvy characters to the thin characters, that the skin is showing many different sorts of things. The skinny characters are much more loud with the lines on their body. It's showing muscles and bones, whereas the curvy people, especially because when we think of curvy people, it's sort of a soft look, it's sort of an elegant look. We're going with really round, bubbly lines, and we're really not seeing much in the way of indication to muscles and bones. We're more seeing the soft skin with the layer of body fat underneath, so everything's much more rounded and soft. So now we're up to drawing the heavy build. Now, what's the difference between a curvy build and a heavy build? Curvy, I would generally say, in terms of an aesthetic approach, would be created with more of a generic, semi-athletic, day-to-day looking person. The heavy build is very similar to the curvy build in our approach because everything's much softer and rounder. The difference is we're just adding fat mass to the body, and it's going to group in various areas to create that really heavy look that we're trying to represent here. But as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use the same skeleton because all we're adding is mass to the outside of the skeleton. So if you're interested, you can actually Google images that are x-rays of overweight people, and you will see how the fat sits around the skeleton structures of the body, and the skeleton is the same as anyone else's skeleton. We're just working with the mass around that. So to begin with, the hourglass figure that we still maintained in the curvy body is less relevant when we're getting to a much heavier set body build style. So when drawing someone with a really heavy set build, we're not able to maintain this hourglass shapely figure because the fat in the body is quite heavy and is going to sink low. So for example, with the breasts, when they're made up of quite a lot more fat tissue, because of how large the person is, they're going to be larger, and because they're heavier, they're also going to sink lower than on the generic body that we've drawn. I'm going to bring my skeleton down a bit so we can see the construction lines we're drawing more clearly. And if you keep that hourglass shape in mind, we're just adding mass to the hourglass shape, but the difference is it's clumping up and it can't hold its mass as well. So we're actually starting to be out at the top and taper into the middle, but the difference is it's going to start to gather, and we're going to have it sort of add upon itself. And we're adding more mass, and the mass is heavy and it's going to sink. So for example, here the belly mass is quite large and it's sinking and heavy to the point where it's going to cover up that groin area of the body until it starts to come back up to the start of the body again. The legs are going to hold a lot more mass as well, and everything is going to be weighted more to the lower parts of the body, but there are some points in the body that will sort of act like anchors, like the knees, where the knee is always sort of visible and the fat sort of gathers around it. Then we have things to keep in mind with the legs. We have thicker ankles before it meets the feet, fairly thick sort of legs here, which tend to make the feet look smaller when we're drawing someone with a really heavy build. When drawing the arms, similar thing, we're bringing out the mass of the shoulders and it's sort of working around with how the fat sits on the body and gathers around places like the elbow. Similar to the ankles, the wrists are going to be quite thick and will make the hands look fairly small in comparison to the size of the rest of the body. The other thing to keep in mind too is that when we get really heavier bodies, we start to see that weight also on the face. So we thicken up the head a little bit, thicken up the neck, and add some fat underneath the head. And this is what the body starts to look like when things are a lot thicker. We can actually make the shoulders a bit smaller because the weight is going to sink in towards the middle part and lower part of the arms. Now we're following the same process with the male. Let's start off with the head this time. So we make a bit of a thicker head, bring out a fat patch under the neck just because the weight is going to be there as well. And with men, fat tissue also builds up around the boobs as well. So we're going to make the man have slightly heavier, saggier breasts and bring out his belly, which is going to be a lot more singular, be sort of like one larger chunk, more so than the female body was. I think simply because the male body is usually sort of more chunky in like more singular large chunks, whereas the female body, because of the birthing hips and all that stuff, things tend to be a little bit more curvy in general anyway. So now we're working on the outline of the larger woman and doing the same thing that we did with our curvy female, but this time we're doing it to even more of an extreme. We're really starting to make things really round and bubbly. Sort of think of all the lines you're drawing as little containers to hold sort of areas of body fat, because when we're drawing someone who has a lot of body fat, the skin tends to be doing a lot of weight bearing. So we need to make sure that that we're communicating that in our drawing. So as you can see, when you compare the curvy body to the more overweight body, the fat is sort of dragging the skin down a bit, particularly in the abdominal region, in the breasts, and in places like the upper legs and thighs. So now we're about to draw our final body type in this video, and that is going to be very muscular. So I've brought back my generic body and I'm bringing back my muscle reference here so that you can see how I'm going to work that into the body types. So when drawing my construction lines, first of all, I'll bring my skeleton down in opacity, and I'm going to start using my construction lines to bring out the muscle areas of the body. Now, we're going to draw a character who is quite muscly and with a fairly low amount of fat under the skin. Now, this is something to keep in mind because when you're drawing very muscular people, the amount of fat under the skin between the muscle and the skin is essentially what dictates how much the muscles show in the lines that define the muscle anatomy. So usually when you see bodybuilders on TV who have lines everywhere and veins and all this stuff, they have very, very little fat under the skin. Now, that might sound logical, but the reality is you can be extremely muscular and not have any of that. You could be more like the strongmen in the strongmen competitions who are almost probably as muscly as the bodybuilders, but the body fat is there as well. So it's actually going to hide a lot of the veins and a lot of that other stuff. Now, I'm also going to point out that with lower body fat, the breasts are still smaller. So when you have a muscular, broad sort of woman, like I'm drawing here, it's fairly common for the breasts to be smaller than on average people because the body fat is also lower than it would be on average people. The other reason for this is, of course, because to have a huge amount of muscle, the body is producing a lot of testosterone, which is sort of the opposite to what produces breasts in women. So we're going to have smaller boobs, and we're also going to show off some of the pec muscles underneath and behind the boobs. So it's kind of going to be a little double here. Now, of course, women can become extremely muscular and bodybuilders, but the thing to keep in mind is that genetics are genetics, and at the end of the day, it would be extremely difficult for a woman to become more muscular than some of the muscular male bodybuilders out there. So while we can have extremely muscular women in our illustrations, it might be a little bit unrealistic to make them as muscular as the male in the same equivalent sort of scenario simply because of genetics. So we're doing the same thing with the male body here. We're just accentuating the areas of muscle, and we can be a little more extreme here with the male physique than we could justify with the female physique. And similar to how we did with drawing more overweight people, we're simply adding mass, but it's more where the mass is being added. So overweight people, we were sort of more adding fat mass and indicating how the skin would sag and hold the different areas of that mass. With this sort of body, the muscle is more holding the skin up. So the skin is sort of hanging on the muscle, as it were, but in a more tight way, because the body of very muscular people, the skin is going to be more stretched and tight than if it were loose with fat. We're also approaching this very similarly to how we actually approached our very skinny character, in that we're focusing on the same sort of ratio of skin to fat under the skin to muscle. Now when drawing the skin on top, we're going to go for a much more masculine look in the lines. So the lines are going to be a little bit more solid, a little bit more blocky, and this is going to help accentuate the tense and strong aspect of the muscles in these characters. The exception, of course, is with the breasts, which are still made up of fatty tissue and should still appear soft and weighty and round, but the muscles around it should still feel solid and blocky and strong. Once again, using pretty solid blocky lines to accentuate the masculinity of this male's bodybuilder physique. The other thing that you can do when drawing muscles on the body to accentuate how vascular they end up looking is to draw extra little lines indicating the direction of the muscle grain in areas like the shoulders and the chest. And this helps show that the muscle is tense and that the skin is stretched over the muscle tightly and that there is little body fat underneath the skin layer. And this is to help achieve that really ripped look that extreme bodybuilders tend to have. And then here we have the finished result of my muscly broad bodies here. If I hide my construction lines, you can see more clearly the body that I've drawn, and you can also see, compared to the other body types that I've drawn, how they differ. It all sort of comes down to finding the right combination of how the muscles, fat, and skin all affect one another to produce the different body types that we get here. And these were all, of course, based on the same generic skeleton of the male and female, so we're not altering the body type that much and not going too dramatic. And you can actually go more extreme than this for all of these. You can go even more broad and muscular with these characters. You can go even more overweight and fat, or even more emaciated and skinny. But this video hopefully has been a bit of a foundation approach as to how you can head down these different roads of producing different body type depictions for your art, whatever that may be. I hope this video has been enjoyable. Thank you so much for watching, and once again, if you're interested in learning to draw the male and female anatomy and figures in more detail, make sure to check out my ebook, Draw with Jazza Easy Anatomy. If you're interested, of course, once again, the download for this reference file is for free, linked to in the description. Thanks for joining, and until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you later. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel to see new content every week. Check out more of my stuff by clicking the annotations over there. You can get the reference files for this tutorial by clicking the link in the description, and if you want the reference files for all the tutorials I've ever made, check out the tutorial archive. If you're looking for a great place to collaborate, explore, or share your own content, head over to newgrounds.com. That's it for now, and until next time, see you later.